He didn't pour me a drink or put a warm hand on my shoulder. That wasn't his way. He sat me down and he looked at me with grave, disappointed kindness, the look of a man about to ask you to be your best self, and he said, "Lena, I want to talk to you about something hard because I think you're one of the most selfless young people I've ever coached, and I'm going to ask you to be selfless one more time." And my whole sacrificing heart, the heart that had been told its whole life that putting itself last was the right thing, leaned in. "You're fast. Faster than Reese, we both know it. And in a world that was only about the individual, that would settle it, and you'd take the spot. But that's not what a team is, Lena, and I don't think a girl like you, a girl who's given up so much for her family, who understands sacrifice better than anyone on this team, needs me to explain that the program is bigger than any one swimmer. Reese needs this. She needs it in a way you don't. She doesn't have your gift. This is her one shot, and it would mean everything to her and to this family. So here's what I'm asking as your coach, as someone who admires your selflessness more than I can say." And here he did it, the soft turn, the robe of virtue pulled tight. "Throw the heat. Swim it slow, just enough. Take yourself out of the running so the spot goes to Reese. Be a team player. Take one for the team. Don't be the kind of swimmer who puts her own glory above the people around her. You, of all people, understand that it's not about you." And then the ask, the one that is the title of my whole story, delivered with all the grave moral weight of a man who'd built a whole career on getting other people to give up what he'd never give up himself. Throw it for his niece. Take one for the team. Don't be selfish. Don't be selfish. I want you to hear those two words, because they were the whole knife, aimed with terrible precision at the one place I had no armor. I sat there, a girl who had been selfless since the age of 9, who had given up her whole childhood and every hour of her life for other people, who had bought her own goggles with stolen feeling coins because spending on herself felt like a sin, and the man I trusted, the man who wore the robe of sacrifice, looked at that girl and called keeping one single thing for herself selfish. He took the deepest groove in me, the lifelong belief that I owed everyone everything and myself nothing, and he pressed on it until it did exactly what he needed. And the deeper cruelty, the one I'd understand fully only when I was grown and dead and reborn, was the exact shape of what he asked. He didn't ask me to lose a race. He asked me to throw the one thing that was mine, the water, the weightlessness, the single selfish hour I'd ever owned, the one door that was mine and the one future that might be, and give it up on purpose for his blood, and to do it while believing I was being good. He asked the girl who sacrificed everything to sacrifice the one thing she'd ever kept, and he made keeping it feel like the sin, and giving it up feel like virtue. And the hypocrisy folded inside it, where a team, it's about all of us, was a lie so complete I couldn't see it at 16, because the sacrifice only ever ran one way, from me to his family, and his niece was never once asked to take one for the team. The team was a thing other people sacrificed to, so that Hale's blood could be carried. And the promise folded in, a girl like you understands, was the trap, because it flattered my wound, made my self-erasure into a virtue, so that the more selfless I'd been my whole life, the more I'd prove it by throwing away the one thing that was mine. And I did it. God forgive the girl I was, but understand her. She'd been trained since she was 9 to believe exactly this, that her needs came last, that keeping anything for herself was selfish, and Hale knew that and used it. I did it. The day of the meet, in my heat, in front of the scouts and the crowd, I threw it. I had the speed to touch the wall ahead of the cutoff, ahead of Reese, ahead of the whole field, and I held it back, swam slow, swam small, swam careful, let myself fall just short of the time, threw away the one thing that was mine so that Reese could have the spot. I gave up the water. I gave up the door. And the worst part, the part that followed me into 36 gray years, is that I knew, in every held-back stroke, that I was killing something, that I was taking the one weightless thing I'd ever owned, the one selfish hour, the one future that might have been partly mine, and surrendering it and teaching myself the lesson that would run my whole life, that I was right to put myself last, always, in everything, that keeping anything for myself was selfish, that the good and virtuous thing was to give up even the door, even the water, even the one thing. And Reese qualified, and Hale gave me a grave, approving nod that I now understood was a receipt, and I climbed out of the pool with the weight already settling back onto my shoulders, never to come off again. And the team did not remember my sacrifice. Of course it didn't. That's the part that finished me. Hale's grave approval cooled the moment it had served its purpose. There was no special treatment, no door open for me later in return, because in Hale's economy the selfless are not rewarded, they are simply used, and a girl who'll throw her own shot for the team is not a girl you owe anything to, she's a resource you've spent. A girl like you understands dissolved into the fog of things men like Hale say to get what they need. And the door I'd thrown, the scholarship, the scouts, the one way out, the one future that might have been mine, closed for good because a swimmer who falls short at the qualifying meet doesn't get the scholarship, and there was no other one coming for a girl with no money and a family that swallowed her whole. The one shot I'd ever had at a life of my own went under with that heat. There was no other door, and the surrender did not stay contained to one heat. That's the thing about being taught at the formative moment by a man you trusted, that keeping anything for yourself is selfish. It doesn't stay one thrown race. It becomes the shape of you. I had been, for a few weightless years, a girl who had one thing that was hers, and Hale, in one office with one ask, taught me that even that one thing was a selfishness I should be ashamed of, and I believed him, because it fit the groove that had been carved in me since I was 9. I stopped swimming because the water had become the scene of the worst lesson, the proof that even my one refuge was a thing I should give away. But it didn't stop at the swimming. The lesson spread, the way it does, into all of me because it didn't teach me to give up one thing. It taught me that I was right to give up everything, that my whole life of putting myself last was not a wound but a virtue, the thing Hale admired me for. And so I never again kept anything for myself. I never took the hour, the door, the chance, the rest, the thing that was mine. I gave it all, always, to whoever needed it more, because there was always someone who needed it more, and I had learned from a man in a robe of virtue that keeping anything back was selfish. I cared for my mother until she passed, and then for my siblings, and then for their children, and then for anyone who needed carrying, and I never once put myself first, never once kept a single weightless thing, and I called it goodness because that is what Hale taught me to call it. The girl who'd found the one place the weight came off became a woman who never let the weight come off again, who carried everyone, always on dry land, and called the carrying her virtue. And I did not cry, and I'll be straight with you about that, because the soft version has me weeping on the blocks and the real version is harder and stranger. What moved through me, standing there with the water flat below me and the goggles tight in my hand, was the clean, total clarity of a girl who has thrown the one thing that was hers, given up her one weightless refuge, and just been handed, against every law of God and time, the chance to swim it true. The strangeness of it nearly buckled my knees that first moment, because nobody tells you what it is to be your grown self and your young self at once, in the same body, on the blocks where it all went wrong. I felt my arms, and they were a 16-year-old's arms, fast and unspent, not yet the tired arms of a woman who'd carry everyone on dry land for 36 years. I felt the goggles in my fist, the one thing I'd ever bought for myself, and the cold tile under my feet, and the water waiting, and I knew the whole future. The thrown heat, the closed door, the weight settling back on for good, the gray decades of carrying, the small infection I'd ignore until it killed me. I knew all of it, carried all of it, in a body that hadn't lived a day of it. For one strange beat I half expected, every time I blinked, to wake back in that gray life with the weight on my shoulders and the dark coming up. But the water was real and blue below me, and the goggles were real in my hand, and slowly the strangeness settled into the one hard certainty underneath, that this was not a dream and not a mercy I'd earned, just a window thrown open one more time, on the blocks, the water still mine, and that I was not going to spend it dazed. I had a heat to swim true. More than that, I had a refuge to take back, a door I'd nailed shut at 9 that didn't have to stay shut, and one chance to keep the one thing that was mine where I'd thrown it. And underneath the clarity, lower down, was something I'd almost forgotten was possible: lightness. Because I looked at the water, and I could feel it already, the weightlessness waiting, the place where the weight came off, the one thing that was mine after 36 years of carrying everyone on dry land and never once floating. I nearly dove in right there just to feel the weight lift, because I'd spent a whole gray life believing I wasn't allowed one thing, and now I was 16 and the water was below me again, weightless and silent and mine, ready to prove that I was allowed to keep something after all. Even if the door had been closed forever, I think I'd have wept just for that, for the water, for the weightlessness, for the one thing I'd surrendered and thought I'd given up for good. The revenge, whatever it became, was always going to run second to that. The first thing was that I had the water back. Everything else came from refusing, this time, to throw the one thing that was mine. The hours before the heat were strange and vivid, and the strangest part was all of them being alive and unwritten again. Hale, robed and grave, and not yet exposed. Reese, sweet and propped up and not yet short of the wall. The scouts in the stands with their clipboards, by cutting her slow true laps in the dawn lane. Eli on the next block, who believed in my speed, whom I'd lost in another life. I moved through that morning the way you'd walk the steps of the worst surrender you ever made, finding every place the first telling went wrong. I found Vi first, at the dawn pool, hauling herself out of the water with her soft, strong shoulders. Not for help with my stroke, for something closer to a true thing to set against a robed one. In my first life after I threw it, Vi had known. An old swimmer that wise, who'd watched me cut the water at dawn for years and knew exactly what my body could do, would have watched me swim slow in the one heat that mattered and known, a girl with my speed doesn't just fall short of her own times by accident. And something in old Vi had gone quiet and sad because she'd spent 50 years on the truth of the water and watched a girl give her one true thing away, and she could never prove it or undo it. So in my second life, I went to her and I said plain, someone wants me to throw my heat, to swim slow on purpose, so his niece gets the spot. And he says it would be selfish of me not to. And Vi looked at me, dripping, with those clear old eyes, the eyes of a woman who'd gotten into a cold pool before dawn for 50 years for no one but herself and never once apologized for it, and she was quiet a moment, and then she said the thing I carried into every lap for the rest of 2 lives. Listen to me, because I'll say it once, and then I'm getting my towel. The water carries everyone the same. That's the whole truth of it, and it's the best truth there is, because it's the one truth no one's love or name or family can buy off. The rich girl and the poor girl float exactly alike, and at the wall there's only the clock, and you touch it in your own time or you don't, and no uncle alive can make a slow girl fast. So you swim yours today, all of it, true, and you let the wall tell the truth the way the wall always does. And one more thing, because I've watched you give that whole pool away your whole life. A girl is allowed one thing. The water is yours, child. Keeping the one thing that's yours is not selfish. It's the only way you don't drown. I did not confront Hale, and people always ask why I didn't expose him the second I woke up knowing what he was. The answer runs underneath this whole story, because a confrontation was a scene, and a scene was a thing Hale would win without his robe ever slipping, because he held the program and the spots and the story and a sacrificing girl's whole future, and worse, because everyone believed in his virtue. He was beloved Coach Hale, who preached sacrifice and team, and any accusation I made would shatter against the simple fact that no one could imagine a man who talked so beautifully about selflessness doing such a thing, that the natural reading of a poor girl accusing the virtuous coach was that she was the selfish one, the ungrateful one, the one who couldn't be a team player, exactly the thing he'd already painted me as. And they'd believe it, because believing him cost them nothing and cost them no part of the comfortable story they loved about a good man and his sacrificing team. The one move his robe had no answer to was a swimmer who simply, quietly, was no longer available to throw the one thing that was hers. So I gave him nothing to push against. I was the selfless girl he expected. And I watched Reese, because Reese was the propped-up niece at the center of it, and I needed to see her clear with my second life eyes. And here's what I saw. A girl who had never once been made to find out whether she could make the time on her own. Reese genuinely believed she belonged in those qualifying spots because the lanes had always been arranged and the path always cleared, and she'd mistaken the clearing for her own speed. She'd never once had to touch the wall ahead of a real rival swimming her real time, with everything depending on her own arms and nothing arranged, because her uncle had built her whole swimming life, so she'd never have to. She wasn't cruel. She was, in her sheltered way, perfectly sweet to me. She was just a girl whose uncle had cleared her path so completely that she'd never been allowed to discover she couldn't make the cutoff herself, and so she had no idea she'd come up short. Remember that. It's why her missing the wall by 4/10 wasn't just a slow swim. It was the first honest measurement of her life, the first time anything had ever depended on her alone, and a person can survive that, even be remade by it, the way I'd never been let to. Reese wasn't the architect. She was the niece the architect carried, and the reason I was told to throw the one thing that was mine.
And there was Eli.
The day of the meet, before my heat, Hale found me one last time, exactly as I knew he would, with the ask he'd built toward. He caught me by the blocks, and he gave me that grave, admiring, "You're such a good girl" look, and he said low, "Remember what we talked about, Lena. Remember it's not about you. Be selfless today, swim it slow, let Reese have it, take one for the team. I know you understand sacrifice better than anyone here. Do this, and you'll know you did the right thing." I looked at him, this man whose robe of virtue had been the whole authority of my surrender, and I felt the weight of 2 lives hang on what I said next. And I said, level and clear as a touch at the wall, "No, coach. I'm swimming mine today. All of it. True. I'm going to let the wall tell the truth. If Reese can make the time when I'm swimming my real one, then she's earned the spot, and I'll be the first to hug her, and mean it. But I'm not throwing the one thing that's mine, the one thing I've ever kept for myself, so that your niece doesn't have to find out she can't make the cutoff on her own." The change that came over his face is a thing I'll remember as long as I can find a wall in the dark. He'd never heard it, not from his selfless girl, not without a seam he could widen back into the old virtuous yes. And the robe slipped, just enough, and what was underneath was cold and aggrieved and entirely without the virtue he wore. After everything this program has given you, this is who you are, a girl who'd put her own glory above her whole team, who'd humiliate a teammate, who'd make this about herself. I thought you understood sacrifice. I see I was wrong. You're selfish, and selfishness has no place on my team, and I'll make sure everyone knows exactly the kind of swimmer who put herself first. You'll be remembered as the one who wasn't a team player. And there it was, at last, the thing under the robe all along. Not virtue, not a man who believed in sacrifice, just a man who'd learned that the language of selflessness is the easiest way to take from people who already believe they owe everyone everything. In my first life, that word, selfish, would have unmade me because it was aimed at the deepest wound I had. But I wasn't only that sacrificing girl anymore. I'd already given everything. I'd lived a whole gray life, giving everything and kept nothing, not even my own life, and died of it. So I said, level and unafraid. Then I'll be selfish. For once. For one heat. I've been selfless since I was 9, coach, and it nearly cost me everything, and I'm done calling it virtue. The water carries everyone the same. You touch the wall in your own time, or you don't. If Reese is fast enough, she'll make the cutoff against my real time. If she can only qualify when I throw mine, then she was never fast enough, and you've always known it, and that's the whole reason you're standing at the blocks calling a 16-year-old selfish, instead of trusting your niece to make the time herself. Watch the wall tell the truth. And I pulled my goggles down, the one thing that was mine, and I stepped up onto the block, and I got ready to swim it true. Here's the part Hale never understood, or had robed himself so thoroughly he'd forgotten. The mechanism under the whole thing, and I'll lay it out plain because it's the engine of everything. The wall is the one honest judge, the touch and the clock, and only a real rival swimming her real time forces a swimmer to find out whether she can actually make the cutoff. In my first life, by throwing it, I didn't lose to Reese. I simply took the real competition out of the water and cleared her path, the way her path had always been cleared. I swam slow, fell short on purpose, and with the one swimmer who could have pushed her suddenly swimming small, Reese touched the wall ahead of my thrown time and qualified, having never once had to find out she couldn't make the cutoff against a real swimmer. My thrown heat was the cleared path. The day I swam mine for real, the path stopped being clear. I swam my true time, touched the wall well inside the cutoff, took my spot on the merits, which meant that for the first time in her sheltered life, Reese had to actually make the time herself against a rival swimming true, with nothing arranged and no lane cleared. And a girl built by cleared paths, made for the first time to make the cutoff on her own arms, did the only thing such a girl can do. She came up short. She touched the wall 4/10 of a second past the cutoff. Point 4, the smallest margin, the exact distance between a swimmer who's fast enough and one who only ever looked fast enough because the real competition was told to swim slow. She didn't miss the wall because I did anything to her. I never touched her, swam my own lane, my own race. She missed it by 4/10 because I stopped doing the one thing that had ever cleared her path. I stopped throwing mine and made her actually swim against a real time, and a girl who isn't fast enough, made to swim true, misses the wall by 4/10. I'll tell you about that heat, because in my first life I threw it, and swimming it true in my second was a resurrection in the water that made me. The starter's tone sounded, and I dove, and I went under into the silence, into the weightlessness, into the one place the weight came off, and I swam it true. Every stroke, every kick, full out. The way the girl who carried a family had only ever dreamed of swimming, the weight gone, the world gone silent, just me and the black line, and the wall ahead, and the water carrying me the same as it carries everyone. And it was the most alive I'd been in 2 lifetimes, because the one thing that was mine was finally, fully mine again, swum true in front of everyone. And I didn't hold back a single stroke. I didn't swim slow or small or careful. I swam the whole of what I had, all the speed the girl who'd never kept anything for herself had been keeping in her arms her whole life, and I touched the wall well inside the cutoff, and I knew, the way you know a true touch, that I'd qualified, that I'd taken the spot that was mine on the merits, in the one place no robe and no favor could clear. And in the next lane over, Reese swam her sheltered best, and reached for the wall, and came up 4/10 short, because the water carries everyone the same, and the wall doesn't care whose niece you are, and a girl who is only ever fast enough because the real competition through their heats is not fast enough when the real competition swims true. And from the dawn lane in my memory, Vi's voice, a girl is allowed one thing. And then hail broke. And around him, the swim parents and the program he'd built his robe on. It happened as Reese touched the wall 4/10 short, as my qualifying time and her miss became undeniable, as the whole pool understood that the selfless girl had swum hers true and the propped-up niece had come up short the moment she had to make the time herself. And I watched the realization move across Hale's face in stages. First the disbelief, the certainty I'd throw it, that surely the selfless girl would take one for the team. Then the dawning horror as I swam true and Reese reached for the wall and came up 4/10 short, as he understood I'd refused, that I'd swum mine. Then, slowly, the full collapse, the understanding that there was nothing to be done, that you cannot unswim a heat or untouch a wall, that his niece had just been measured honestly by the one judge no favor could reach, and found 4/10 short, and that there was no virtuous story he could tell over it. And then his face did the thing I'd waited 2 lifetimes to see. The robe came all the way off, the grave virtue and the beautiful talk of sacrifice all falling away, because he'd just understood that Reese's whole place in those spots, her whole qualifying career, had only ever existed in the space my thrown heats made, and the one time I refused to throw mine, the niece missed the wall by 4/10.
He made a sound.
Not loud. The small, stunned, terrible sound of a man discovering that there was, after all, one thing his program couldn't arrange and one wall his favors couldn't clear, a touch in true time, and that the selfless girl he'd told to throw it had used her one selfish heat to take the spot, in the open, where it couldn't be undone.
I did not go to him.
I want that on the record, because it's the heart of who I'd become. I didn't climb out and explain that Reese had missed the wall by exactly the margin of the one thing I'd refused, this time, to give away. I stood by the pool with my qualifying time on the board and Vi's words warm on my chest, and I let Hale break, because his breaking was not a thing I had to fix, and never had been. The only thing I'd done was swim my own race true and decline for one heat, to throw the one thing that was mine so his niece wouldn't have to find out she couldn't make the cutoff herself. The rest he'd done himself, the day he put a robe of virtue over pure nepotism and called a girl selfish for keeping the one thing she'd ever owned. And then something happened that told me everything about what the cleared path had built. Reese came to me, dripping, by the lane ropes. Not gracious, not at first. She came with the hollow, stunned look of a girl whose whole understanding of herself had just come apart at a single wall, and she said, half to herself, "I always make that cutoff. I've always made it. Uncle said I was ready. He said the spot was," and she stopped, and I watched her do the arithmetic she'd never had to do. Watched something move behind her eyes, the first crack of an awareness that maybe the lanes had always been arranged, that maybe she'd never once had to make the time against a real swimmer, that maybe she'd never found out what she could actually do because someone had always made sure she wouldn't have to. She wasn't cruel about it. She was just a girl meeting the true measure of her own speed for the first time, which is a hard thing to meet, and harder still to suspect that the uncle who loved you arranged for you never to meet it sooner. "You swam yours," she said finally, almost wondering, looking at the board like it was the first honest thing she'd seen all day, and there was something under it that was nearly relief, the relief of a girl who spent her whole career uneasy about a thing she couldn't name finally seeing it named. I heard she got better after that, once her uncle's hands came off her lanes, trained for real, made her own cutoffs or didn't, and lived with the truth either way, became a swimmer she'd actually built. The niece hail held up as the reason to make me throw the one thing that was mine turned out to be another girl the robe had failed, just more sweetly than it failed me. Reese wasn't the architect. She was the niece, for tenths short and freed. So I told him. Not the rebirth, not the gray years, not the small infection I'd ignore until it killed me. The mechanism. I said, "You found a girl who'd been selfless since she was 9, who'd given up her whole childhood for her family, and you took the one thing she'd ever kept for herself, and you called keeping it selfish so your niece could have a spot she wasn't fast enough to take." But Reese was never fast enough. The only reason she ever qualified was that I threw my heat. My thrown heat was the cleared path. The one time I swam mine true and made her make the cutoff herself, she missed the wall by 4/10, because that's exactly what a girl does when the real competition stops swimming slow for her, and you've always known it. You're the one who told me I was faster than her, the day you told me to throw it. I let it sit. And here's what your robe never let you see. The water carries everyone the same. The wall doesn't care whose niece anybody is, or how beautifully you talk about sacrifice, or how good you've made a girl feel for giving everything away. You touch it in your own time, or you don't, and there is nothing. Not your program, not your speeches, not all the virtue you wear, that can make a slow girl fast or clear a wall that's 4/10 too far. You preach sacrifice my whole life, coach. But the sacrifice only ever ran one way, from the rest of us to your blood. Real sacrifice you'd have asked of your niece too. You just asked it of the girl who already— He didn't have an answer. There was no robe left to wear. He looked at me like he was seeing, for the first time, the thing his virtue had spent years keeping him from seeing, that the selfless girl he'd told to throw it had one thing his program could never arrange or clear or take, which was the speed in her own arms against a true clock, and that she'd used it to take the spot, in the open, where the whole pool watched his niece come up 4/10 short. I qualified. I want you to sit in those words, because in my first life they were the great unbearable if I carried into a gray weighted-down life and a death of self-neglect. If only I'd swum it true, and in my second they were simply what I did. I touched the wall inside the cutoff, and I took the spot that was mine, the selfless girl who beat the propped-up niece in true time, in the open where it couldn't be cleared away, and with it came the scouts and the scholarship and the door, the one way out, the one future that might be partly mine. The thing Hale's robe had been the price of closing, because the one thing that had ever stood between me and a life of my own was a heat I threw and the lesson it taught, and the moment I swam. It true. The years after were the years I should have had, and I want to tell you about the two things that meant the most because there were two losses, and the second life recovered both. The first was the water. I became the swimmer I was born to be. Of course I did. The only thing that had ever stood between me and a weightless life was a man who taught me my one refuge was selfish, and the moment I swam that heat true, the water was simply mine again. The weight off, the silence, the lightness. I swam for real. won on merit, kept the one thing that was mine, and the scholarship took me through school and into a life I built. And I won't tell you the family stopped needing me because they didn't, and I won't tell you I stopped caring for them because I never would, but I cared for them from a life that had the water in it, from a place of fullness instead of from the bottom of a hole. And that made all the difference, because a girl who's allowed to float can carry far more than a girl who's drowning. But the second loss was the deeper one, and recovering it was the real second life. Because the worst thing Hale did wasn't closing the door. It was teaching a selfless girl that keeping anything for herself was selfish, confirming, with the authority of a man in a robe of virtue, the lie I'd been raised on since I was 9, that my needs came last in everything, even the need to not die. And that lie had carried me, in my first life, all the way to a death of pure self-neglect, a woman who tended everyone and never herself. And the second life unlearned it. Because here is the thing I understood, touching the wall in true time with the spot mine and Reese 4/10 short, that keeping one thing for yourself is not selfishness. It is the only way you don't drown. The girl who keeps nothing back, who pours from an empty cup, who gives even the water away, she doesn't help anyone in the end. She just dies of the giving and leaves everyone she carried with no one to carry them. The selfish thing, the truly selfish thing, would have been to keep throwing my heats and call it virtue while a slow girl took spots she didn't earn. Real love, real care, the kind that lasts, comes from a person who's kept enough of herself to give from. And Hale, who wore the robe, had it exactly backwards, the way the takers always do. And once I understood that, I stopped believing the lie. I kept the water. I kept one thing for myself, always, and I learned, slowly, that the people I loved were not diminished by it. They were better cared for by a woman who hadn't drowned. The girl who threw the one thing that was hers became a woman who never threw it again, who carried her family her whole life and kept the water too, and was therefore strong enough to carry them well. And there was one more thing, the quietest. I never forgot what it is to be the selfless kid, the one who carries everyone, the one some robed person decides to take from because she already believes she owes the world everything. So, I became the opposite of the man who'd taken from me. When I found a kid like that, the caregiver kid, the one who'd given up her whole childhood, the one some virtuous voice was teaching that keeping anything for herself was selfish, I did the one thing Hale never did. I told them the truth Vi told me, that the water carries everyone the same, and the wall doesn't lie, and that a girl is allowed one thing, and keeping it is not selfish, it's the only way she doesn't drown. I taught the carrying kids to keep one thing for themselves, to find their own water, to understand that a refuge is not a betrayal of the people they love, but the very thing that lets them keep loving them, because some of what I came back for was them. The next girl who carried a family from the age of 9, who'd never be told by a man in a robe that keeping the one thing that was hers made her selfish. I saw Hale one last time, years later, and it's the truest measure of how far the two roads had run apart. I was an established name by then, a swimmer who'd made the life she'd nearly thrown away, back near the old pool for something, and Hale was old, diminished, a faded former coach whose robe had worn thin now that the program had moved on without him, and the swimmers he'd carried had scattered and ordinary, the truth of his one-way sacrifice quietly known to enough people that the beautiful talk no longer landed. He saw me, saw the swimmer I'd become, the life, the standing, the unmistakable fact that the selfless girl he'd told to throw the one thing that was hers had built a whole weightless life he could never take a piece of, and the old complicated recognition crossed his face. He came over. He said my name, just my name, Lena, the way they always do at the end. And I waited to feel the old thing, the selfless girl's need for his approval, the deep groove that said putting myself last was virtue, the part of me that would have thrown anything to be told I was good. And it wasn't there. Where it had been was a clean, quiet space, because the need had finally, fully died, not in bitterness, but in completion, the way a hunger ends when you finally, at last, let yourself be fed, which in my case was the simple fact of having kept the one thing that was mine, and discovered the world didn't end, and that I could love and carry and give from a full life instead of an empty one. He tried to talk. He said something about how I'd always been his most selfless swimmer, how a team has to make hard choices, how a coach has to think of the whole program, how he hoped I understood the position he'd been in. It was the closest Hale could come to an apology, and it still managed to wear the robe. And I noticed, listening, that I didn't need it. Not the apology, not the admission, not anymore anything he had to give, because he'd never actually held the thing I loved. He'd only ever had the virtue talk to make me give it away. In my first life, I'd have given anything for this man to tell me I was good, would have thrown the water 100 times to earn it. But I'd found the real thing years before, the day I swam mine true and kept the one thing that was mine, and I'd been living weightless ever since. I didn't need Hale's approval. I'd become the thing his robe could never produce. So I let him finish, and I didn't argue, and I didn't accept it either. I just let it land in the air between us and dissolve. I had a real teacher once, I said, and let the pause sit before I finished, an old swimmer named Vi. She taught me that the water carries everyone the same, and that a girl is allowed one thing, and keeping it isn't selfish, it's the only way she doesn't drown. And I gave him a small, distant, final nod, not the needful upward look of the girl who'd have thrown the water to be called good. That girl was at rest now, allowed her one thing at last, gone with the gray weighted-down life and the death of self-neglect that no longer count. And then I went back to my own life, my own weightless water, my own carrying kids learning to keep one thing for themselves, and I left Hale holding the memory of a girl he'd told to throw it, who had— I think about that office sometimes. The grave admiring look, the robe of virtue, the line, "Throw it for my niece, take one for the team, don't be selfish, a girl like you understands sacrifice," and how in one life I obeyed and threw the one thing that was mine and carried the weight forever and drowned on dry land, and in another life I refused and swam it true and kept the water. The whole divergence of two lives, the difference between a woman dying of giving everything away and a woman who kept one thing and was therefore strong enough to give, came down to a single word at the blocks.
No.
The smallest word, and the first truly unselfish thing I ever did, because keeping myself whole was the only way I'd ever have enough to give. People think revenge has to be loud. I thought so too. In the dark after my first death, the confrontations, the exposures, the satisfying ruin. But the most complete revenge I ever took was to swim my own heat true while the man who told me to throw it discovered, by 0.4 of a second, what his niece was worth without a real swimmer being told to clear her lane. I never raised my voice except to say no. I never touched Reese. I swam my own lane, the way you always do. I just kept the one thing that was mine and let the wall tell the truth. And it turned out the whole thing, Reese's spots, Hale's robe of sacrifice, all of it, had only ever been standing on my willingness to throw the one thing I'd ever kept, and the one time I refused, the truth came out at the wall, and the truth was a touch 0.4 short. I've thought a great deal, across two lives, about the particular way Hale unmade me, because it's the most insidious version of the ask in this whole family of asks, and almost no one names how it works. The cold villains threaten, and the warm ones charm, and you can at least see those coming. But Hale used virtue. He made giving up my one thing feel like goodness and keeping it feel like sin, and there is no defense against that for a person who's spent her whole life being praised for having no needs of her own. He didn't tell me I was worthless. He told me I was selfless, admirable, better than the others, and then he asked me to prove it by erasing myself one more time. That's the trap, and it's set for exactly the people most likely to walk into it. The givers, the carriers, the ones who already believe they owe everyone everything, who can be made to do anything if you frame it as one more sacrifice and frame their refusal as selfishness. And here is the thing it took me dying to understand. The thing I tell every girl who's being praised for her selflessness right up until the moment it costs her everything. The word selfish is the favorite tool of people who want to take from you, and they aim it precisely at the people who will never actually be selfish, because those are the only people it works on. A truly selfish person can't be shamed by the word. It bounces right off. It only wounds the giver, the carrier, the one who already gives too much, which is exactly why the takers save it for her. Real selflessness doesn't require you to have nothing of your own. That isn't virtue, it's just slow self-erasure with a halo painted on. And the people who demand it from you, who call your one kept thing selfish while exempting their own blood from any sacrifice at all, are not teaching you goodness. They're teaching you to disappear, because your disappearance is useful to them. So no, I don't feel a flicker of guilt that the niece touched the wall 0.4 short. I never touched her. I just stopped throwing the one thing that was mine to feed a virtue that only ever flowed one way, and let the wall tell the truth. Keeping one thing for yourself is not selfishness. It is the only way a person who gives doesn't give herself to death. The people who tell you that keeping one thing for yourself is selfish and call it virtue are almost always the ones who've already decided to take it. I threw the one thing that was mine once, for a man in a robe of virtue, and I drowned on dry land carrying everyone but myself. I won't throw it again. Not in this life, and if there's another after it, not in that one either. I'm in the water most days now, weightless, the one thing that's mine kept at last, and I carry the people I love from a full life instead of an empty one, and I teach the carrying kids to keep their own one thing. And every time I push off the wall and feel the weight come off, I think about the girl who threw the one thing that was hers for a man who called it virtue, who carried everyone on dry land and drowned of it, and I'm so grateful she got the chance to do it differently. Because that girl on the blocks didn't just win back a spot. She won back the water, the weightlessness, the silence, the one thing that was hers, the permission to keep something for herself that she'd surrendered and thought she'd given up for good, and the simple, total, hard-won truth that a girl is allowed one thing, that keeping it isn't selfish, that it's the only way she doesn't drown. And she never, ever, threw the one thing that was hers again. I died the first time with the one thing that was mine thrown away, carrying everyone on dry land, killed by the one person I never took care of, myself. I intend to die the second time an old woman who kept the water to the end, weightless, with a life of true swum heats behind her, and a family I carried well because I never let myself drown, and a generation of carrying kids I taught to keep their own one thing. And if the weight comes for me again at the end, some last thing I cannot put down, let it find me having kept the water, having floated, having understood at last that a girl is allowed one thing. All the way down. Same water, both ends of two lives, and only one of them thrown away. The first time it was the phantom of everything I surrendered, the one thing that was mine, given away at a robed man's grave and virtuous word, and then dry land where I drowned under the weight. This time it's the real thing, everything I kept, the heat swum true and the wall telling the truth and the weight lifting, mine in the open for good. And the only thing that ever stood between the two was a single word, at the blocks, said level and unafraid to the man who told me that keeping the one thing that was mine was selfish. No. One word, and the weight came off, and it stayed off, and I learned the only lesson that ever mattered, that you cannot carry anyone if you've let yourself drown.